The watch we're going to look at today is a little different and a little special. It's called the Victory Sands by Praesidus Watches, a brand known to honor veterans and military history. And along those lines, this particular watch and a few others were made to commemorate the 80th anniversary of the Battle of Iwo Jima, which during World War II was one of the most important and bloodiest battles of the Pacific Theater, and especially for the Marine Corps, as well as it's also the source of one of the most iconic photos during the war. Now, in some ways, this is a really simple quartz field watch, one based on the older A11 mil-spec watches from the war. And remakes of those A11s is something Praesidus has done before. But at the same time, there's some really interesting aspects and design choices put in here just to honor the Battle of Iwo Jima, including what's below the map on the dial. But before we get to all of that, I need to give you a little bit of a disclaimer that Praesidus provided this watch and they're not asking for it back. Hence the whole promotional tag at the beginning. That, and you also need to know that this watch is not a full production model. They mentioned that it was an earlier sample watch, which I think basically means it's a later stage prototype. Now, from what I know, there won't be any differences between this and the full watch. But since it isn't a full production model, just be aware of that. That said, let's get to it, and let's start off with the specs. And then we'll jump into the dial, as that's the most important part here. And before we get to that, try to guess what's behind the map on this dial. So for this one, Praesidus modeled it after those A11 watches, and here it is 38mm wide with a rather compact lug-to-lug of 45. So it's not quite historically accurate. I think those original A11s were more like 32mm. Pretty small by today's standards. So for this one, they kind of put it somewhere in between that and more of a modern field watch. Total thickness here is 13.5mm. That also includes a very iconic case back and a very domed acrylic crystal. With this one, there's no screwed down crown, but even without that, it still rates 100 meters of water resistance. It's also extremely lightweight at 50 grams, uses 20mm straps, which opens up a lot of alternative strap options. And I'm glad to see that this watch is assembled in the USA, I believe at a facility in Arizona, as well as it's also powered by the AmeriQuartz 6130 quartz movement. And in case you've never heard of the AmeriQuartz movements before, they've been around for a few years and they're made by FTS USA out of Arizona. And while the watch as a whole doesn't qualify for the Made in the USA tag, with the American assembly and the American built movement, honestly, this is about as close as you can get to an American-made watch these days. Which I think is very important for a watch like this. Using any other movement or assembling it somewhere in China just wouldn't feel right for what they're doing. And for the price, it is listed at $320 US. But try to wait until the end until you actually comment on that price. As well as know that they occasionally have discounts and that 5% of their sales goes directly to veterans organizations. As well as the whole American assembly, American quartz movement, all that factors into this over other quartz watches. Now, Praesidus has made 3 different versions or 3 different colorways of this watch. 2 of which feature the battle map of Iwo Jima on the dial, one of which is in orange and the other in white. And then the last watch is kind of a reverse, where it features the iconic flag raising on the front and a battle map on the case back. Yet, all 3 of them have this textured base dial, which underneath the battle map or the iconic flag raising is actually made from volcanic sand from Iwo Jima, giving it not only a very unique look with the various colors contained in each grain, but also a really interesting historical, physical connection to the island. And I think it's also important to point out here that Iwo Jima is not exactly an easy place to go to these days. As far as I know, it's still completely uninhabited, and for civilians, the only way to get there are a few authorized tours offered throughout the year. So I'm not exactly sure what hoops they had to jump through in order to do this, but they did it. And while I'm generally not a fan of this orange-colored loom used here, I gotta say that here against the sand, it does look rather cool, especially with the black case, as the orange just pops out at you, and especially paired with the gunmetal hands and the indices. Which normally I would complain about a real lack of contrast when you have kind of these darker gray hands and indices against the darker gray of the sand dial. And it is worth noting that. That's kind of why I'm bringing it up here, that this is sort of a weak point in terms of readability, or at least it could be. But here, with this particular watch, I can kind of understand why they did it. The focus here is supposed to be on the map. And I gotta say that the orange on the hands just pops out at you, and I never really had a problem reading it while wearing it. Even the indices, which in some of these shots really blend in, wasn't that hard in real life to see where they were, as they are slightly polished and catch the light differently than the dull grains of sand. So here, there's not exactly great contrast in terms of colors, but there's a contrast in textures, and that does help. So this is a pretty busy dial, but I think it's one that's really cool and interesting from a historic standpoint, which in some ways is a stark contrast to the case. The case has a pretty solid feel to it, and it's a stainless case modeled after those older A11 watches. And this one feels like it's been blasted completely smooth and then coated with a black DLC finish. Again, giving this thing a really stealthy, subtle look. And that's completely different from their other version, which doesn't have that black DLC and is more of a white painted dial. Now, if I remember right, they actually call that version the cream colorway and they call this one the orange colorway, which kind of makes me think of a creamsicle. But I think the better way to look at this is more of a night vision version versus a day version. Now, once again, the case is very simple. There's not really much frills to it. But I was really happy to see these really small drilled lugs to make strap changes even easier. And speaking of the strap, I'm not really sure how much I can tell you about what's going to come with the watch. The strap they provided with this one is this black suede with orange stitching, and I think it looks really good with the watch. But when I looked on their website, if you wanted to order one, and it shows a black rubber strap. So I think the strap they provided here is more of a one-off just for the prototype. And can't really tell you much more than that. Other than on this strap, as well as on the few other straps I tried, the watch as a whole is really comfortable to wear. I mean, as small as it is and as light as it is, yeah, it's going to be comfortable. That's really shouldn't be a surprise here. Quartz watch at 50 grams is like wearing nothing. Now, before we wrap this whole thing up, I do want to address some of my concerns or nitpicks with this one, as there are a few things I want to talk about. The first of which is a second hand. Now, yes, this second hand doesn't perfectly line up with the indices. And yes, I know it's annoying, and I know this is the reason some of you really don't like quartz watches. But I also gotta tell you that after all of the quartz watches I've seen over the years of running this channel, I don't really hold this against the watch, especially since it's a prototype. Because beyond that, there are very few brands, and especially at this price point, where I've consistently seen quartz watches that are perfectly lined up. I've even seen my fair share of Casios that are off. So again, I don't really hold it against it, but I know some of you like to know this. And speaking of the whole automatic versus quartz thing, that's another talking point. Now, I'm betting some of you out there are already commenting that you would love this as an automatic. But the fact is, they decided to go with quartz. And even though I'd kind of like to see this as an automatic as well, I think here quartz is the better idea, and especially going with the AmeriQuartz movement, as it not only makes the watch more appropriate, but makes it more accessible to more people, regular people. Because there are plenty of veterans and history buffs and devil dogs out there who might like this. Ones who aren't watch collectors, and they just want a good watch that they don't have to worry about winding or setting constantly. So with that in mind, that opens us up to a broader audience. There's also the acrylic crystal, and plenty of you regular viewers know I prefer sapphire. So for me, this is a little bit of a negative, but at the same time, I completely understand that acrylic is more appropriate for what they're trying to do here. So while I'd prefer sapphire, I'm okay with the acrylic. But I also wouldn't mind it if the domed crystal wasn't quite as domed. Mostly because out here at the outer edges of that domed crystal, those edges always seem to catch some stray light and glare, which I think has been apparent in some of these shots. Now, as for the loom, loom just flat out sucks. There's no other way to say it. And that's actually probably my biggest concern with it. I do like the fact that they loomed everything up, including that map. It looks really cool when it first gets dark. But as a whole, it really doesn't last long. So more loom or better loom would be nice. But bottom line, is that it's a simple quartz watch with a rather busy, unusual dial. One that really stands out. Yet it's also a really interesting watch that commemorates and reminds us of an important event in history. It's also kind of an odd watch to really recommend. Usually when I do these reviews, I like to think about who this watch is really for. And here, I think it's well built and decently priced, but with the commemoration of Iwo Jima, you kind of have to have a connection or a calling towards that to want and wear it. So basically, this one's going to be for the history buffs, the military buffs, the veterans, and maybe those currently serving in the US Navy and Marines, as Iwo Jima was a bloody but historically important event in both of their histories, one worth remembering. So if you are one of those, go ahead and check it out. But as usual, let me know your thoughts down below. And especially if you are interested in this, I'd love to hear what you feel is kind of calling you towards it. Were you a veteran, or is it just kind of the historic military connection? And as always, you guys know what to do down below. Like, comment, subscribe, all that stuff. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and I'll see you next time.